What if I told you that some of the world's most celebrated royal jewels were never meant to survive close inspection, and that the closer you look, the worse they get? These are pieces built for one purpose: to stun a crowd from 20 feet away, to glitter under chandeliers, to command a throne room packed with hundreds of onlookers who would never dare step close enough to see the truth. And the truth is this: many of these jewels look spectacular from a distance and borderline absurd up close. They were designed for applause, not examination. And once you understand how they were made and why, you'll never look at royal portraits the same way again. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. This channel is about the details you're never meant to see up close. The first piece that makes this concept impossible to ignore is the coronation necklace worn by Queen Alexandra at her 1902 coronation. From across Westminster Abbey, it looked flawless, a cascade of diamonds forming perfect loops that caught every flicker of candlelight. But photographs taken after the ceremony tell a different story. The diamonds are set in heavy, unrefined frames. The metalwork is visible between stones. The overall effect, when viewed at portrait distance, looks clunky and mechanical, more like industrial scaffolding than fine jewellery. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't look elegant in close-up paintings. It looks engineered, and that's exactly what it was. This necklace was built to survive hours of ceremonial wait while throwing maximum light across a massive Gothic space. The settings had to be strong enough to hold stones under physical stress. The diamonds had to be spaced wide enough to reflect light in all directions. Refinement was sacrificed for projection. Delicacy was traded for durability. The result was a piece that succeeded completely at its job and failed completely at intimacy. Modern high jewellery is the opposite. It's designed to impress in photographs, to look flawless under close inspection, to feel precious when worn at a dinner table. Alexandra's necklace had no such concerns. It was built for a room of 2,000 people, most of whom would see it from 50 feet away, and none of whom had cameras capable of exposing its rough edges. But this isn't the only piece that reveals how much royal jewels relied on distance to work. The Grand Duchess Vladimir tiara, now owned by the British royal family, is one of the most famous convertible tiaras in existence, and one of the least graceful when examined closely. This tiara features 15 interlocking diamond arches, each one topped with a pearl or emerald drop that can be swapped depending on the occasion. From across a ballroom, it looks regal and balanced, but look at it in museum lighting or high-resolution photographs, and the structure starts to feel chaotic. The arches don't align evenly. The drop pearls hang at slightly different lengths. The diamonds themselves are set in thick, visible prongs that create a cage-like effect. It looks busy. It looks heavy. It looks like something assembled in a hurry. And in a sense, it reflects the realities of late 19th century Russian court life. Imperial jewelers worked under constant demand to produce showpieces for an endless calendar of state events. The tiara needed to survive being worn, transported, modified, and re-worn across decades of use. It needed to make an impact the moment a Grand Duchess entered a room. It did not need to look refined in a glass case a century later. The convertible mechanism, the ability to swap emeralds for pearls, was a practical solution to a logistical problem. Russian royalty didn't have infinite budgets or infinite jewels, despite what propaganda suggested. One tiara that could serve multiple visual purposes was more valuable than two perfect static pieces. But that versatility came with a cost. The engineering is visible. The tiara looks like what it is, a tool. This is the paradox of distance-dependent design. The smarter the engineering, the uglier the result becomes under scrutiny. And that principle only gets more extreme with the next piece. The Italian cameo parure, a suite of jewellery created in the early 19th century, and worn by various European royal houses, contains one of the most awkward tiara designs still in ceremonial use. It consists of carved shell cameos set in heavy gold frames, connected by loops of gold and pearl. The cameos depict classical scenes, gods, muses, mythological moments, rendered in cream and coral tones. From a distance, especially in candlelit 19th century settings, it would have looked harmonious and refined, evoking ancient Greece and Rome. But in modern photography, especially under flashlighting, it looks mismatched and clumsy. The cameos are too large, the frames are too thick. The mixture of cream, coral, gold, and white pearl creates a visual noise. It doesn't read as elegant, it reads as crowded. And yet this style was considered the height of sophistication when it was made in the 1810s. Neoclassicism was the dominant European aesthetic. Cameos were symbols of education and taste. Wearing carved shell was a way of signalling cultural refinement. The jewellery wasn't just ornament, it was a costume piece for a specific ideological performance. But here's the problem. Neoclassical aesthetics relied on soft, diffused light. They were designed for salons lit by candles and oil lamps, where shadows would blur the edges of the cameos and the gold frames would glow warmly. Modern lighting is harsh. It exposes every detail. It flattens the depth that made the piece work. The result is that cameo jewellery now looks dated in a way that simpler diamond pieces do not. This reveals something important. Some royal jewels weren't just designed for distance. They were designed for extinct lighting conditions. They depended on an entire lost environment to function aesthetically. But distance wasn't the only trick. Some jewels relied on motion to hide their flaws. The stomacher worn by Queen Charlotte at her 1761 coronation is a perfect example of jewellery that only worked while the wearer was moving. A stomacher is a large triangular ornament pinned to the front of a bodice, covering the chest and upper stomach. Charlotte's stomacher was covered in diamonds, arranged in floral sprays and bows. From across the room, while she was walking or turning, it would have shimmered and sparkled, each movement sending light in new directions. But the moment she stood still, the design would have looked stiff and static. The diamond sprays don't follow the natural curves of the body. The bows are symmetrical to the point of looking artificial. The whole piece reads as flat. That's because it was designed to be seen in motion, not in repose. 18th century court ceremonies involved constant movement, processions, dances, formal presentations. The jewellery needed to perform under those conditions. A stomacher that looked perfect while stationary might look dull while walking. Charlotte's stomacher made the opposite trade. But there's another issue: scale. Stomachers were enormous. Charlotte's piece would have covered nearly a foot of vertical space on her torso. That works in a throne room where observers are far away and need something visually dominant to anchor their gaze. It does not work in portraits, which is why many paintings of Queen Charlotte either omit the stomacher entirely or render it in simplified form. Artists knew it didn't translate. This is the clearest example of jewellery that sacrificed static beauty for kinetic impact. And it's far from the only one. The next piece takes that principle even further. A tremblant tiara in the Spanish royal collection, attributed to the mid-19th century, looks nearly perfect in motion and bizarrely unbalanced when still. It features diamond flowers on long tremblant springs, mechanisms that allow the flowers to tremble and shake with every movement of the wearer's head. When the tiara is being worn at a ball or state dinner, this creates a hypnotic effect. The flowers seem alive. They catch light from every angle. They draw the eye and hold attention. But photograph the tiara on a stationary display, and the springs become visible. The flowers sit at odd angles. The piece looks fragile and overly delicate, like it might fall apart if touched. And in a sense, it might. Tremblant jewellery is mechanically complex and prone to damage. The springs can bend, the flowers can detach. This is jewellery that requires constant maintenance and careful handling. But for 19th century Spanish royalty, that was an acceptable cost. The visual effect during wear was worth the fragility. What makes this particularly interesting is that modern jewellers have largely abandoned tremblant work. It's expensive to produce, difficult to repair, and doesn't photograph well. 3 things that matter enormously in today's jewellery market. This tiara survives as a relic of a time when live performance mattered more than documentation. But not every distance-dependent jewel relied on motion. Some relied on sheer, overwhelming scale. The Nizam of Hyderabad necklace, given to Queen Elizabeth II as a wedding gift in 1947, is one of the largest diamond necklaces in the British Royal Collection. It consists of nearly 300 diamonds arranged in floral and geometric patterns, forming a bib-style necklace that covers the entire upper chest. From across a state banquet hall, it looks breathtaking, a wall of white light that radiates wealth and power. But here's the tell. Look at it closely, and the problems become obvious. The diamonds vary wildly in size and cut. The settings are inconsistent. The overall design lacks symmetry. Some sections look dense and heavy, while others look sparse. It doesn't feel curated, it feels assembled. And it may have been assembled from multiple sources. The Nizam of Hyderabad had one of the largest private jewellery collections in the world, and this necklace appears to include diamonds that don't quite match in origin or cutting style. The goal was maximum visual impact, not technical perfection. This approach made sense for the Nizam, whose wealth was measured in spectacle, but it creates a piece that looks less impressive the closer you examine it. The necklace works at 10 feet. It struggles at 10 inches. Queen Elizabeth II wore it sparingly, and when she did, it was almost always for the most formal occasions, events where she would be photographed from a distance and seen by large crowds. She understood what the necklace was for, but if you think that's as overwhelming as distance-dependent design gets, the next piece will prove you wrong. A heavily jewelled ceremonial sword in the Portuguese crown jewels collection is described in historical records and museum displays as being encrusted with diamonds across the hilt, and it's one of the least ergonomic objects ever designed for ritual use. From across a throne room during a coronation ceremony, the sword would have looked magnificent. Every slight movement would have sent light cascading across the stones. It would have been impossible to miss. But the uglier detail is this. The design prioritizes spectacle over function. The hilt appears too heavy for comfortable use. The surface creates an uneven grip. The balance seems wrong. It's a sword designed to be held aloft for 30 seconds during a ritual, not a sword designed for wielding. And that was entirely intentional. Portuguese coronation ceremonies involve the monarch holding the sword vertically while standing on a raised platform, visible to hundreds of attendees. The sword needed to be seen, not wielded. Its function was symbolic, not practical. The stones were arranged to maximize reflective surface area, not to create a usable weapon. But here's what makes this particularly striking. When the sword is photographed up close in museum contexts, viewers are often surprised by how crude the settings appear, how unrefined the metalwork looks, how little the piece resembles modern ideas of fine craftsmanship. That's because modern fine craftsmanship is designed for inspection. Portuguese coronation swords were designed for awe. But not all distance-dependent jewels were ceremonial. Some were worn regularly and looked worse for it. The Devant corsage brooches worn by European royalty in the late 18th and early 19th centuries are some of the most impractical pieces of jewellery ever normalised. A Devant corsage is a large ornamental brooch pinned to the centre of the bodice, often featuring diamonds, coloured stones, or cameos arranged in elaborate designs. They were meant to be focal points, visual anchors that drew the eye and signalled status. From across a reception hall, they worked perfectly. But the flaw becomes obvious when you consider the mechanics. They're too heavy. They pull fabric downward, distorting the shape of the dress. They create pressure points that become painful after an hour. And because they were pinned at a single central point, they tended to rotate and shift, requiring constant adjustment. Portraits from this period show Devant corsage brooches looking perfectly positioned and balanced. Real-life accounts describe them as uncomfortable and annoying. The gap between ideal and reality was enormous, and yet they remained popular for decades because their purpose wasn't comfort, it was projection. A woman wearing a large Devant corsage brooch was making a statement about wealth and taste. The discomfort was an acceptable cost. Modern jewellery has largely abandoned this design for obvious reasons. But the principle survives. There are still pieces designed more for how they photograph than for how they feel. And nowhere is that more evident than in the next example. The diamond diadem of Bavaria, created in the early 19th century and worn by Bavarian royalty for state occasions, is one of the most visually overwhelming pieces when seen in person. The diadem features hundreds of diamonds arranged in crosses and floral motifs, with large gemstone clusters positioned across the front. From a distance, especially in formal portraiture, it looks balanced and regal. But here's what strikes observers in museum settings. The scale becomes almost comical. It sits high on the head, making the wearer's face look small by comparison. The gemstone clusters are so large they dominate the visual field. It doesn't feel proportional. And that's because it wasn't designed for proportion, it was designed for visibility. Bavarian royalty commissioned elaborate diadems during a period of political competition with neighbouring German states. They needed jewellery that would be seen from the back of massive throne rooms and state churches. They needed pieces that would reproduce well in engravings and paintings, which were the primary way most citizens would ever see their rulers. The diadem succeeded at both goals, but it created a piece that looks best in specific, controlled contexts. Formal ceremonies, official portraits, commemorative imagery. In casual settings or close-range photography, it looks excessive. This pattern repeats across European royal collections. The more important the ceremony, the more extreme the scale, and the worse the piece looks under intimate inspection. But even the Bavarian diadem looks restrained compared to the final example. The imperial state crown of Russia, used from 1762 until the fall of the Romanov dynasty, is the ultimate expression of distance-dependent jewellery, and the ultimate example of a piece that collapses under close inspection. It contains nearly 5,000 diamonds, 75 pearls, and multiple large gemstones, including a massive red spinel. From across a throne room, it would have looked like a solid mass of light, almost supernatural in its brilliance. But examine it closely, and the construction is startlingly rough. The diamonds are set in thick, visible metal frames. The pearls are mounted on heavy posts. The overall structure is dense and cluttered, with little negative space. It looks less like fine jewellery and more like armoured plating. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. Russian imperial crowns were designed to communicate absolute power. They weren't meant to be beautiful in a delicate sense. They were meant to be overwhelming. The goal was to create an object so covered in gemstones that it became difficult to process visually, an object that signalled wealth beyond comprehension. But that approach had consequences. The crown was incredibly heavy, nearly 4 pounds. It caused headaches and neck strain. Monarchs who wore it for extended ceremonies described it as physically painful. And because the gemstones were set so densely, the crown didn't move or sparkle the way lighter pieces did. It just sat there, glittering but static. This is the clearest example of a jewel designed entirely for distant spectators. The closer you get, the less impressive it becomes. The experience of wearing it was miserable, but none of that mattered, because the people who saw it in person were never close enough to notice the flaws, and the monarchs who wore it understood that suffering was part of the performance. What all of these pieces share is a design philosophy that modern jewellery has largely abandoned, the idea that a jewel's purpose is to command a room, not to survive scrutiny. They were made for environments we no longer inhabit: throne rooms lit by candles, coronation ceremonies attended by thousands, state events where distance created mystique. In those contexts, they worked perfectly. But we live in an age of high-resolution photography and museum display cases, an age where jewellery is expected to look flawless at any distance. And under those conditions, many of the most celebrated royal jewels in history start to look awkward, chaotic, or even ugly. That doesn't mean they failed. It means they succeeded at something we no longer value: the art of spectacular distance.